everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're diving into something a little different.
Whoa.
You know how we usually go for these big topics.
Right.
Well, we're getting very specific this time.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about a part of your body you might not even realize you have. It's called the plantaris muscle.
Yeah, most people haven't heard of that one, but the funny thing is almost everybody has it.
Isn't that wild? It's like this hidden treasure in your leg.
It really is.
And we have an awesome piece of research to guide us today.
Okay.
It's a scientific monograph all the way from Croatia.
Wow, all the way from Croatia. Interesting.
I know, right? The title is Plantaris Alpha, Radiological Assessment of the Incidence of M. plantaris.
That's a mouthful.
And this thing is trilingual.
What?
Croatian, English, and German.
Wow. They were serious about getting this information out there.
That's what I thought, too.
So the plantaris is often called vestigial.
Vestigial.
Yeah. It means it's lost its original function over time.
Kind of like our tailbone or the appendix.
Exactly. Like a leftover from way back when.
Wow. So it's basically useless.
Well, that's the thing. It might not be as useless as we think.
Really?
It's surprisingly common, and get this, it's even used in some surgeries.
Seriously?
Yeah, so these Croatian researchers, they took measurements from 348 people, and they used ultrasound, MRI, and CT scans to really get a good look at this muscle.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
It is. And that leads us to the big question of this deep dive. What did this research tell us about the plantaris muscle in the Croatian population?
Okay, so before we get into the findings, let's make sure everyone has a good picture in their head of this mysterious muscle.
Good idea.
What exactly are we looking at here?
So picture this, a small, thin muscle kind of shaped like a spindle.
A spindle, okay.
You'll find it in the back of your lower leg hanging out with the calf muscles.
So it's like the calf muscle's little buddy.
That's a good way to put it. Now, the plantaris has a short, fleshy belly and a long, thin tendon that goes down towards your heel.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
And here's where it gets interesting. Are you ready?
I think so. Hit me with it.
They found this plantaris muscle in every single person they studied, 100%.
Wait a minute. I thought we said it was a vestigial, like basically useless.
I know, right? That's the paradox.
So if it's not doing much of anything, why is it still there?
That's the million-dollar question.
So what is it doing?
Well, the research says it's a two-joint muscle, meaning it crosses both the knee and the ankle.
So must help with bending your knee and putting your toes right.
It does, but just a tiny bit, like 0.7%.
So it's not exactly a powerhouse.
Not really, more like a backup singer in a band.
Okay, I get it.
Oh.
So if it's not about strength, what's its real purpose?
This is where it gets really fascinating. They found that the plantaris has a ton of these things called muscle spindles.
Muscle spindles.
Yeah, they're like little sensors in your muscles.
Sensors.
They send info to your brain about how stretched your muscles are and how fast they're changing length, and it's all about something called proprioception.
Proprio what now?
Proprioception.
Say that 3 times
I
fast.
know, right? It's your body's awareness of where it is in space.
Okay.
Like, think about it. You can walk without looking at your feet, right?
Yeah.
You can touch your nose with your eyes closed.
Oh, yeah.
That's proprioception in action, and the plantaris might be playing a role in that.
So even though it's small, it could be helping us stay balanced and coordinated without us even knowing it.
Exactly. Pretty cool for a useless muscle, right?
Super cool. So how do they actually see this muscle?
They used all sorts of imaging, ultrasound, MRI, and CT scans.
Oh, I love medical imaging. It's like getting a sneak peek inside the body.
It is. So ultrasound uses sound waves to create images. It's great for seeing soft tissues like muscles.
Like when you see a baby on an ultrasound.
Exactly. Then there's MRI, which uses magnets and radio waves to make super detailed pictures of organs and tissues.
And what about CT scans?
They use X-rays to make these cross-section images like slices of your body.
So they used all 3 to really map out the plantaris muscle.
That's right. And they found something really interesting. You ready for this?
Always.
The plantaris can actually be used for tendon grafts.
Tendon grafts.
It means they can take that long, thin tendon we talked about and use it to replace damaged tendons and other parts of the body.
So they literally transplant it.
Yep. They often use it for hand and wrist surgeries.
Wow. So this little muscle is kind of a lifesaver.
You could say that. And they were using ultrasound to figure out who would be a good candidate for a tendon graft.
Makes sense. Ultrasound is good at looking at tendons. Right?
Exactly. One of the studies they cited said that any plantaris tendon wider than 2 millimeters on the ultrasound was good to go.
So this little muscle that we thought was useless is actually pretty important.
It is. And here's a fun fact. When they were doing the ultrasounds, they had people lie on their stomachs with their feet hanging off the end of the bed.
Why such a specific position?
They found that was the best way to get a clear picture of the Plantaris.
That's so interesting. So they got all these measurements, and then they looked at other things like height, weight, age, sex, even if it was the left or right leg. Did they find any connection between those things and the size of the muscle?
Great question, and it's a big part of what they were trying to understand. Does the size of this muscle change based on those other factors?
So did they find any connections?
Well, surprisingly, no, they didn't find any strong correlations.
So it doesn't matter how tall you are or how much you weigh, you probably still have a plantaris muscle back there.
That's right. Now, here's another interesting thing. They used all these different imaging techniques, ultrasound, MRI, and CT scans, but did those methods all agree?
That's a good question. You'd think they'd all show the same thing, right?
You'd think so, but that's where it gets a little tricky.
No.
The radiologists were really good at taking measurements, within each method.
Okay.
But the measurements from ultrasound, MRI, and CT scans, well, they didn't always match up perfectly.
So even though they were taking good measurements, the type of imaging itself could have made a difference.
Exactly. Each technique has its own strengths and weaknesses, and they might highlight different things about the same structure.
It's like trying to describe an elephant just by touch, right?
Yeah. Someone feeling the trunk is going to have a different idea than someone feeling the tail.
That's a great analogy. So this difference in measurements, what does that mean for us?
It's a good reminder to think critically about medical information,
Okay.
even imaging results.
So which measurement is the most reliable if they're all different?
Well, this monograph points to MRI as potentially the most accurate for visualizing the plantaris and its tendon.
Okay, interesting. But you mentioned earlier they collected data from a group they called the Rat Pack. Did they really call them that?
They did, but Rat Pack was actually an acronym.
Oh, okay. I was picturing Frank Sinatra and the gang hanging out in a lab.
Right. It stood for Random Anthropometric Team Plantaris Alpha Checkup Keystone.
Well, that's a lot less exciting.
Not as catchy, I guess.
So who was this Rat Pack? Tell me about them.
It was a pretty diverse group in terms of age and sex. They all lived in Croatia, though.
Okay, so this study gives us a look at the Plantaris in the Croatian population.
That's right.
Okay, so can you tell us a little about the average Rat Pack member?
Sure. The average participant was a woman about 60 years old with an average height and weight for that age.
So like your typical Croatian grandma.
Yeah, pretty much. They did a ton of measurements, though.
Really?
Anthropometric measurements. So they measured the girth of people's legs at different points.
Wow. Talk
Yeah.
about getting into the details.
I know, right? They were really thorough, and they looked into whether there were any differences in plantaris size between the left and right legs.
I would guess that'd be pretty symmetrical.
You would think so, but they wanted to be sure.
So were there any differences?
No, nothing significant.
So no matter which leg's your dominant one, your plantaris muscles are probably about the same size.
That's what it seems like.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned ultrasound, MRI, and CT scans before. Did they use all three on every single person in the study? Not quite. There were two main groups. Okay. The first group had about 695 people, and they had both anthropometric measurements.
So they were literally getting their legs measured for this study.
Yep. And they had ultrasound imaging.
Okay.
Then the second group, they called it the retrospective group, had about 491 people who'd already had MRI scans and 158 who'd had CT scans.
So they used data that already existed to learn more about the plantaris, even though those scans weren't originally for this study.
Exactly. It's a clever way to expand their research, and they actually found some interesting variations in those scans.
Oh, like what?
Well, remember we were talking about the plantaris being this kind of mysterious muscle that maybe doesn't have a clear job in humans anymore?
The so-called vestigial muscle, right?
Right. Well, in some cases, it might not be so vestigial after all.
Really?
Yeah. One of the studies they cited found something called an accessory plantaris muscle.
An accessory plantaris muscle. What is that?
It's basically an extra slip of the plantaris muscle.
Like an extra muscle.
You could say that. So instead of just one plantaris muscle, they had kind of like a little branch of muscle running alongside it.
So some people actually have two plantaris muscles.
That's what they found. And they saw this extra muscle in a few people who'd had MRI scans for knee problems.
Wait, knee problems. So could this extra muscle be causing issues?
That's a good question. And that's one thing the monograph doesn't really get into. They just note that this extra muscle exists.
So another mystery for science to solve.
It really is, and it just goes to show that there's still a lot we don't know about this muscle. We've looked at its structure, its potential role in proprioception, its use in tendon grafts, and now we're seeing these anatomical variations like this extra muscle.
It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. We just keep finding more and more.
Exactly. And that brings us to the big picture. What does all this mean for the average person who probably didn't even know they had a plantaris muscle before listening to this deep dive?
It's definitely made me think differently about my legs, that's for sure. So what are the big takeaways here for our listeners? What should they remember about the plantaris muscle?
I think the biggest thing is that our bodies are just incredibly complex.
Yeah.
The plantaris might not be a muscle we think about a lot, but it shows just how intricate our bodies are.
Right.
Everything's connected, working together.
It's like a symphony.
It is. And even though the plantaris might not be the star of the show, it's still playing a role.
Exactly. And even though this study focused on Croatia, these questions apply to everyone.
That's right.
What is the plantaris doing in our daily lives? Could it even be important for athletes or for preventing injuries?
Those are great questions, and it makes you wonder, could strengthening this muscle be beneficial?
Maybe something to look into.
And here's something practical for your listeners. If you ever have pain in the back of your lower leg,
Okay.
especially if you've been active,
Yeah?
don't rule out the plantaris muscle. It can get strained or even rupture, especially from running and jumping.
Oh, wow. So it can really cause problems.
It can. So pay attention to those little twinges.
Good advice. And if anyone wants to see their own plantaris muscle, can they just ask your doctor for an ultrasound or MRI?
They can, but it might be tough to spot even for the experts.
So it's like a hide-and-seek champion.
Pretty much. But even if you can't see it, you can appreciate what it might be doing for you every day.
And who knows, maybe someday we'll learn even more about it.
There's always more to discover.
Well, I think we can all agree that the plantaris muscle deserves a little more credit than it gets.
Definitely not just a useless leftover.
It's a reminder that our bodies are full of surprises and that there's always more to learn.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of the plantaris muscle. We'll see you next time.